All right, so we're on chapter 18. So the translation reads, the Supreme Personality of Godhead said, the giving up of activities that are based on material desire is what the great learned men call the renounced order of life, sannyas. And giving up the results of all activities is what the wise call renunciation, tyag. So I say, and you all please repeat, the Supreme Personality of Godhead said,
the Supreme Personality of Godhead said,
the giving up of activities
that
are based on material desire is what great learned men call the renounced order of life, sannyas. And giving up of the results of all activities is what the wise call renunciation or tyag. Oh, there's a short purport here. The performance of activities or results has to be given up. This is the instruction of Bhagavad-gita. But the activities leading to advanced spiritual knowledge are not to be given up. This will be made clear in the next verses. In the Vedic literature, there are many prescriptions of methods for performing sacrifice for some particular purpose. There are certain sacrifices to perform to attain a good sun or attain elevation to higher planets, but sacrifices prompted by desire should be stopped. However, sacrifice for purification of one's heart or for advancement in the spiritual science should not be given up. Sri Bhagavan Uvacha Karmyanam Karmanam Nyasam Sannyasam Kavyo Viduhu Sarva Karma Pala Tyagam Prahus Tyagam Vichakshanaha. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, the giving up of activities that are based on material desire is what the great learned men call the renounced order of life, sannyas. And giving up the results of all activities is what the wise call renunciation or tyag. This particular verse is the answer to the question that was raised in the last verse, which is Arjuna asking, I wish to understand the difference between sannyas and tyag, or renunciation, and the renounced order of life. And it seems kind of interesting that Arjuna is asking this question again. You get the sense that Arjuna is having trouble with this issue all the way from the very beginning, because at the beginning of the third chapter of Bhagavad-gita, Arjuna asks a very similar question. If we go back there, we get 3:1. Arjuna said, O Janardana, O Keshava, why do you want to engage me in this ghastly warfare if you think that intelligence is better than fruit of work? So at the beginning of the third chapter, he's not asking about sannyas and tyag, but he's asking about why is it better to, if you think that being intelligent, one should not work, but yet you're telling me to engage in this war. And then again, in the fifth chapter, very beginning, we have this. First, you ask me to renounce work, and then you recommend work with devotion. Now tell me which of the two is most beneficial. So again, the question here is between renouncing work and working with devotion. And then, of course, where we are today is up here in the 18th chapter, which is where he asks, I wish to understand the purpose of renunciation, tyaga, and renounced order of life, sannyas, killer of the Keshi demon, master of the senses. So this is kind of a confusing set of issues. And it's not just confusing for Arjuna, it's confusing for everybody. We wonder what we really mean by the concept of renunciation. And many people have a false conception of what renunciation actually is. You know, in general, we think that renunciation means to give up everything. We have this stereotypic idea of a hermit with maybe just a loincloth living in a cave on the top of a mountain somewhere. And this is our stereotypic understanding of renunciation. But this is not exactly what we mean by renunciation. But this can be a type of renunciation, although hardly anybody does it. And secondly, in the Krishna consciousness movement, we don't recommend it. You know, it's not exactly what we're trying to put forward as our model of a Krishna conscious person. So what is the real conception of renunciation? So we have to tease these concepts apart. One idea is the idea that we are actually discussing, which is sarva karma pala tyagam. So pala in Sanskrit means fruit. Sarva means all. So sarva karma. So all the fruit of action, tyagam, one renounces. We're not renouncing the action, we're renouncing the fruit. So let me say that again, because this is where most people get tripped up. We are not renouncing the action, we're renouncing the fruit. So you may wonder, well, we see devotees driving around in cars, they have computers and these little love-em pads and things like that, and all this kind of stuff. So where is their renunciation? Well, again, we are not renouncing the action, we're renouncing the fruit of action. And that's not as easy to grasp as you might think. What do we mean by renouncing the fruit of action? Everything that we do, it has some result. So if we're working, if we're speaking, if we're building or creating or planning, everything has some goal, has some end game. So what is that? Are we doing it for our own aggrandizement? Are we doing it so that we will be better known, so that we will be having our praises sung by multiple choirs? Or will we actually be doing it for some other reason? Generally, people do whatever they do because they see a personal, tangible benefit for that activity. It makes them richer, it makes them smarter, it makes them more famous, it makes them more strong, it makes them more politically powerful, and in this way, we hope to glorify ourselves. And this is all basically a boomerang back to our false ego. So we're doing these things for our own glory in some way or another, to increase one of these opulences, our fame, our knowledge, our strength, our renunciation, our beauty, or our wealth, you know. But these things are not necessary. Rather, if we do things for the purpose of glorifying not ourselves, but the Supreme, then that very same action is liberating. Whereas before, when we do it for ourselves, it's entangling. And so that's why it may seem paradoxical that devotees are doing various items of activity, but they may look exactly like what everybody else does. We see devotees work, we see devotees go to school, we see devotees engage in all kinds of things, building things, planning things, fundraising, organizing, etc., etc. But the end game or the purpose is not to make each individual one of us or a organization. We are actually doing it to please the Supreme Lord, to give Krishna to the world. And so therefore, this is sarva karma pala tyagam. This is the giving up of all the fruits of action. Of course, the action is a little different, although from the outside, it looks like any other action anybody else might do. But its purpose, that's what we're pointing at, its purpose is different. So we are not renouncing action, we are redirecting the purpose of action. And therefore, we are not claiming the fruit, we are giving the fruit to Krishna. So it's as simple as that. This is the renunciation that we actually are putting forward. We are not putting the, naked yogi with a loincloth in a cave on the top of a mountain type of renunciation. One can do that kind of renunciation, but that kind of renunciation is actually very difficult, and it's incomplete. So sometimes in the past, people did that kind of going to a mountaintop and renouncing everything, eating only fruits and roots, whatever could be found, having no friends, having no association with anyone else, having no money, spending time only trying to meditate. Kali Yuga, this is totally impractical. And one, even with all this renunciation, will still carry our mind with us, and our mind will not shut down. Although we may refrain from contact with the outside world by this naked monk on the mountaintop concept, we might disconnect in a physical way from the world, but our mental process, our mind will not disconnect, and we will have difficulty trying to control the mind, and that's why most likely it will fail. But if we learn the process, the practice of gradually giving up the fruit of our activity, that will not fail, and that will not be that difficult. Of course, we usually do it in gradation as we become devotional. We learn to give up the fruit of our action by doing things more Krishna and less for ourselves. And this is the secret of devotional service. And of course, this is what Arjuna is having trouble to grasp. He thinks, if I am becoming a yogi, or I'm becoming a spiritual person, then I should refrain from acting. But no, Krishna is not telling him to give up the action. He's telling him to give up the fruit of action. So when one gives up the fruit of action, that is called tyag. That's what Krishna is defining the term tyag here in the second verse of the 18th chapter. Sarva karma pala tyagam. So this is what the wise call tyag. However, in contrast to this, we have the concept of sannyas, which is karmyanam karmanam nyasam, which is giving up all activity which is aimed at, how does it put it there? Based on material desires, right? Giving up all activity based on material desires. So the concepts are certainly related. They are not foreign concepts from one another. They're related, but their relationship is a little difficult to understand. So the idea of sannyas is giving up not just in a general way the fruits of action, but giving up all activities which are aimed at some kind of fruitive result. And in this case, what we mean by fruitive result is this process in the Vedas that we call pravrti marg, or activities based on personal gratification, but through a Vedic formula. So the Vedas have two types of formulas. One of them is what we call pravrti marg, where a person engages in Vedic activity that is sanctioned in the Vedas, but still its purpose is to become materially happy. So there are various sacrifices, and these sacrifices, as Prabhupada is giving as an example, to get a good son, or to have one's business prosper, or to enter the heavenly planets. There are such sacrifices, and they are listed in the Vedic texts. But such sacrifices are material, and the whole bag, or the whole collection of such sacrifices, is called the pravrti marg system. We do these things, and they're listed in the Vedas, but it's quite plain that the purpose we do them for is for increasing our material ego again. As we were saying before, it will increase our wealth, it will increase our beauty, it'll increase our fame, it'll increase our knowledge, it'll increase our strength, etc. So in this way, we are doing these things for a material purpose, but they are listed in the Vedas. So we're doing them not in a personal and ugly way, where we'll create problems for ourselves and society, but we're doing it in a regulated Vedic way. So the idea of sannyas is to give up all such activities and engage only in activities directed toward pleasing the Supreme Lord. So the two concepts are interrelated. And in his book, Burijan's book, Surrender Unto Me, he describes that Arjuna is wondering, are these two words, tyaga and sannyas, are they completely different words like tree and mountain? Or are they related words like Pandavas and Kurus, where Pandavas are a subset of Kurus, but in the battle we pit them against one another, and we see them as in contradistinction to one another. So Pandavas, Kurus, and so Arjuna is wanting to know, are tyaga and sannyas two different things completely, or are they related? And if they're related, how do they relate to one another? What's the thing that connects them? So both of them, we see, are giving up something. In the strict definition of sannyas, we see that it means giving up all activities that are directed toward material gratification, whereas tyag means giving up the fruit of activities. So they're similar, but a little bit different. And one caveat that I should place here is that here we're talking a technical distinction between the two. Do not think that throughout all the Vedas and all the explanations that this technical distinction is always maintained. Many times we talk about tyag and sannyas in much more general ways, with no real distinction between these two words. So in many cases we're talking about them in a very more general way. So, but here Arjuna wants to know the specific difference, so Krishna is giving him a technical distinction between the two. All right. So questions about any of that? Anybody has any problems, or did I confuse you so much that nobody even knows what to say at this point? But we were trying to understand the difference between sannyas and tyag, and we're trying to understand what renunciation of fruit actually means, because that's the real purpose of Bhagavad-gita, is to give us this idea of devotion, and devotion is totally understood within this concept of giving up the fruit. Yeah.
Raj, can you please explain how what it means when a devotee in ISKCON, a follower of Prabhupada, takes the vow of sannyas? How does that connect with? How does that relate to the meanings of these two different words?
Well, the order of sannyas is a specific. What we have is varnas and ashrams, and Krishna describes in the Vedic literature, in Bhagavad Gita, he talks about the four varnas, which are Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra. But he also, in Srimad Bhagavatam, we hear about the ashrams, which are the brahmachari or brahmacharini ashram, the grihastha ashram, the vanaprastha ashram, or vanaprastha, and the sannyasa ashram. So these are statuses of life. So generally, the brahmachari or brahmacharini ashram is the beginning stages of life, where a person is celibate but only temporarily, and learns the process of spiritual life and tries to follow the process of spiritual life. And then generally this status of brahmachari, brahmacharini, phases into the next one, which is a later stage of life. And that stage is called grihastha, where there's marriage, and then there's children and trying to raise a family of some sort. So that's the grihastha ashram. And generally speaking, this goes on until about age 50, and then the husband and wife take what's known as the vanaprastha ashram. And there, at that time, presumably, the children are older and maintaining themselves at this point. The couple, they detach themselves from whatever gainful employment they had before and put that all behind them and start to focus entirely on spiritual culture. Now, traditionally, what would happen is the husband and wife would travel to various holy places and, in this way prepare themselves that life was kind of gradually coming to an end. And then there is a fourth order, which may or may not happen, where the wife and the husband separate, and the husband becomes solo, and he takes what's called sannyas. At that point, there's absolutely no contact with the wife anymore, and there's also no contact with any other women as well. One is completely celibate in the sannyas order. And in the sannyas order, one teaches and travels. And in India, when a man takes the order of sannyas, according to Indian law, he's considered legally dead. And therefore, if there's some inheritance or whatever, it passes on to the sons or whatever. And he is only maintained by the welfare of whoever he encounters. And so the person taking sannyas is totally dependent on the Supreme for everything, for his food, for his shelter, everything. And the idea is that such a sannyasi will travel from one place to another, and in the people that he meets, he will help them to get disentangled from material life. They will provide him something to eat or some shelter, but at the same time, he will provide them with the knowledge to disentangle themselves from the material world. And this is called sannyas. Of course, this can also be done in the vanaprastha stage as well. It does not necessitate sannyas. And then there are some people who take sannyas at the very early stages of life and bypass the entire grihastha ashram or the marriage ashram. and they never become involved in a family or so, and they give their lives to teaching. So basically that's the idea of sannyas, that one is completely detached from any kind of process for developing a family and maintaining all the difficulties that go with maintaining a family. Instead, such a person is totally gearing their lives for giving spiritual life to others, basically. That's how it works. Any other questions? Yeah. Which one is better? What? You mean of these two, Tyaga or sannyas? Well, they're both good. Sannyas is, of course, a little more extreme. Generally, when we talk about sannyas, even in ISKCON, people are not granted the order of sannyas now until they're at least 50. When I was, what's that?
I think it's 40.
What's that?
I think it's 40.
Is it 40?
Yeah,
They dropped it.
Yeah, I think so. Mahatma is 41.
Oh, okay.
Bhaktivinoda Tirtha Maharaj.
Okay, okay. So, when I first was involved in Krishna consciousness, there was no age restriction on sannyas, but there was such a poor batting average of people remaining sannyas that eventually in ISKCON they pushed the age up. By that point, a person would generally be more serious about the idea of sannyas. But at one point, the ratio of people who actually remained in sannyas was very poor, but now it's very good. That there's a lot of checks and balances and things in place now, and generally they don't allow people to take the order of sannyas until 40, whatever it is. So one has to be, actually actively involved in preaching, has to have a good profile of understanding the Vedic knowledge, et cetera, and then they can take the order of sannyas. So I was grandfathered in, but I came in from an earlier stage before all that was in place. But I'm dedicated to the idea of trying to give my life to the process of teaching others. And generally, sannyasis travel, and most of the sannyasis in our organization, ISKCON, travel quite widely. I'm one of the exceptions. I stay in one place, but I travel the world in a subway. So I go from one country to another on various subway stations. So any other questions about this? Yes.
Hare Krishna. Just a question. As a woman, if you're a householder, when your kids grow up and then you're at a certain age, is there the same possibilities for women too to teach and to?
Yes, women can also give their lives to teaching. There are several women in our movement who do that, and they travel. The idea is that when a person becomes very serious about spiritual life, they begin to realize that what most people spend their lives doing, trying to build a boat, which we call a family, and make it watertight with no holes anywhere, and make sure everybody's well taken care of, et cetera, et cetera. At a certain point, the children are kind of on their own, and there's no real need for the parents to be involved. But still, people are attached to living in a certain way, living in a certain style, having a certain spread of a house, et cetera, et cetera. So this is why at an advanced stage of life, people do not disconnect from the material world, but they kind of keep that going, So actually, the process of spiritual life means to kind of recognize that at a certain point, we don't need this whole maintenance anymore. And if we can begin to have a genuine desire to give Krishna to the whole world, then we become focused on that. And as we do, then the necessity for all these other things becomes gradually unimportant in our lives. And as it does, then we realize we need far less than we once thought we did. And we become gradually detached from all these things. And in that way, our lives become, at one point, we were concerned with the day-to-days of balancing checkbooks and changing oils in cars and, being sure that the garbage disposal works and that the rent has been paid, et cetera, et cetera. And we move from that to a life where we're actually thinking about what preaching program am I involved in, how can I try some other process to meet more people, et cetera, et cetera. That's a very different kind of life. And Krishna will support whatever order one is, if one is serious about preaching, the Supreme Lord will arrange for whatever necessity we make, we need. Yeah.
Thank you, Maharaj, for being here. I have a question about the sannyasi, the renounced order of life. At age 40, according to Rajananda, is when someone can be embraced sannyasa. However, these are entering the advanced stages of life. It appears to me that the older one gets, the human body have a lot of challenges, especially with health issues. It just seems to me that it's going to be very hard for someone to be able to serve God and keep with the demands of the body, like as the body ages. Isn't that very challenging? Be a sannyasi and taking care of, let's say somebody has cancer or somebody has leukemia or something like that, and at the same time trying to serve God and trying to live a very rigorous spiritual life of renunciation.
Well, that's, in some senses it is challenging, but generally speaking, we see that when people become involved in sannyas, that in their preaching they meet lots of people, and oftentimes those people then help when they have some physical issue. I know many sannyasis, like our, Atmanivedana Swami. He had cancer not so long ago, and he worked it out. Partly he has, he's from Scandinavia. He has some kind of health care base there, or in South Africa, one of those two places. I forget where it was, And he also has disciples who helped him. Or you all, I have to thank you for the whole thing with my overbite. My teeth just. So over time now, my mouth has been completely riveted and everything. But these kind of things can happen where whatever issue a person has, then people help them in some way to get beyond it. But, also there's many other ways that devotees deal with these kind of issues. And in this way we see that some way or another Krishna provides for people, that whether they do it in the United States or in India. In India we have the Bhagavad-gita Hospital, where those who are in the renounced order of life can go there and get medical treatment for free if necessary, and so forth. And we have a number of ways where these things can be handled. And it's my own realization that many of the sannyasi godbrothers I know are much older than I, and they have serious health issues. And somehow or another it's being taken care of. Yeah, many like that we can.
I had one question. In 5th chapter, when Arjuna asked that question, sannyasa and karma yoga, so Krishna, he says, like decisively, he says that karma yoga is better than sannyasa.
Right.
And so how does it fit into this?
Well, Arjuna is trying to understand this idea of karma or of action. He thinks that by fighting, he is engaged in material activity, which a lot of people have that conception, that acting must mean material. And if you're not acting, therefore you're spiritual. That's back to the, naked monk on the mountaintop concept, So if we refrain from acting, we must be spiritual. Of course, nobody can really refrain from acting for any serious length of time. But we're saying, no, that's not what makes someone spiritual. Not refraining from action is not necessarily spiritual. What is spiritual is refraining from claiming the fruits of action, which is what we were just mentioning a minute ago. And that's the message that Krishna gets to Arjuna. Arjuna gets that, finally. First time, he was thinking that he would avoid sinful reaction by avoiding the war and instead becoming a meditator in the forest. But Krishna is saying that's not your varna. You're not a brahmana, you're a kshatriya. Kshatriyas fight. That's what they do. And so Arjuna is bypassing the one thing that's actually his duty. If he were a brahmana, it would be proper for him to suggest the idea of not engaging in battle, because brahmanas would not engage in battle. But that's not the varna that he's a part of. So now Krishna is telling him that it's not, the wrong thing is not his fighting, but the wrong thing is thinking that he is the doing it for himself. He's doing it for a higher purpose. He's doing it for duty. He's doing it to serve Krishna. And therefore, he is not going to get the karma from the battle. Otherwise, if he was doing it for himself, he certainly would get the karma. So later on now, in this 19th chapter, or 18th chapter, he's wanting to understand the subtle nuance between tyaga and sannyas. So that's what Krishna is explaining.
So, and then the second question is that, as the war is going to start, why is Arjuna worried about, the sannyas and tyaga?
Well,
I think he should be,
yeah. I think he's just trying to understand some more nuances there. This, as Prabhupada says, the 18th chapter is a summary chapter. And the second chapter is a summary chapter too. So in public speaking, they say that the way to get across an idea is to tell people what you're going to tell them, and then you tell them, and then you tell them what you just told them.
Yeah.
So it seems like the Bhagavad-gita is set on that same idea. You tell people what you're going to tell them, which is what happens in the second chapter. Then you tell them, which happens from chapter 3 up to chapter 17. And then in chapter 18, you tell them what you just told them. So that's the way Bhagavad-gita works. And 18 and chapter 2, both of them are double wides, I call them. They're, about twice as many verses as the whole rest of it. Most of them are somewhere in the 20 to 30 verses per chapter range. But both chapter 2 and chapter 18 are in the 70s. So they're bigger chapters. So this chapter will be on for a while. And so this chapter is about those basic issues. And we're going to talk about the modes of nature more again, because chapter 14, chapter 17, and 18 discuss the modes of nature. That's what's going to happen later on in this chapter. You had a question back there, yeah.
Yeah, I think you kind of began to answer, but I understand sannyasa as being like, giving up sense gratification and working directly with, teaching and meditating, praying, all that. But
right.
With tyaga, is it kind of like I'm looking for, I guess, like a real world example of tyaga? Like, is it like saying it's okay to, for example, being ambitious in business, but then taking what you've made and giving it back to Krishna, like building temples or something? Or is it more saying like, try to do good in your life, but don't be regardless of what the results may come out.
Well, yeah, tyaga is a more general word. It's a word that actually can be applied to householders or brahmacharis or brahmacharinis or vanaprasthas or sannyasis. It's a general word, whereas sannyas generally refers to a particular setup in the world where one is completely out of the category of doing some physical employment for a particular thing. So that's where the two things are a little different. But as far as if you are engaged in some kind of field of activity, some kind of professional life, then one can attempt to do that professional life as best as one can. There's nothing wrong with that. But then it all hinges on this idea of sarva karma pala tyagam. That's the word I'm trying to spit out. Sarva karma pala tyagam. So it all hinges on that. What are you doing with the results of your activities? So you can get a sense of whether you are doing what they call nishkama karma, which means activity that is not based on material things. So nish means it's the negation, kama means desire. So nish kama, non-desire karma. So you've got kind of tricky because kama means desire, but karma means work. So karma has the R in it, but kama does not. So nishkama karma is this same thing as sarva karma palatyagam. So it's the same concept that we can judge the purity or the spirituality of our occupation by to what extent we use the fruits for our own gratification and to what extent we use the fruits directly in service to the Supreme. Every endeavor has results, some money that comes from it, there's some position that comes from it, there's some prestige or fame that comes from it, etc., etc. These are all the downstream backwash of any kind of occupation. So do we use those things that come from the occupation for our own benefit, or do we use them for serving the Supreme? And generally we discover in the process of spiritual life, in the beginning we are using the results of our actions, at least to some percentage, for ourselves. And as we progress in spiritual life, we learn how to use less and less for ourselves and more to use in the direct service of the Supreme. So this kind of ratio between how much we're doing it for ourselves and how much we're doing it from the Supreme, this is called karma mishra bhakti. We are doing fruit of activity, but it's also bhakti at the same time. And as we get further along, we try to purify it to where it becomes more bhakti and less karma, or fruitive, So that's the kind of thing that we're talking about. Very few people start off in the pure bhakti stage. Rather, what we start off is in a mixed proposition. And as we become more and more focused on spiritual life, then we begin to back off and we start doing things more and more purely. As we begin to become detached ourselves, as we begin to get older and we become less involved in all the necessities of a family and et cetera, then it's easier to gradually move the ratio up to where we're doing things almost entirely for the Supreme. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and then just a follow-up. So is it kind of a direct correlation that as you develop your spirituality, you just will have less, like there's nothing inherently wrong with ambition or sense gratification or whatever, as far as like having, I don't know, like nice things or rare
foods or whatever luxuries. That's not inherently wrong, but like as you develop more, you just sort of would desire them less, so you naturally give them up.
Right,
basically.
right. Generally, the more we desire, specific things, the more we want specific, hard to get things in the material world, the more we become entangled in the activities it takes to possess them. And so those are entangling. And as we learn about spiritual life, we begin to follow the basic idea of trying to minimize our necessities in the material world, not maximize them. And of course, that takes a struggle because we are all attached to various material things. But as we become more and more spiritually oriented, that detachment slackens and we become more able to push more into spiritual life and become less focused on what we exactly have, because very few people, especially in the Western world, are in any serious danger of not eating or not having something over their head, or not having sufficient clothes. But the problem is that we have very specific formulas for what we think we need around us. And the more specific it is, and the more it is, the more likely it is that we're going to be struggling like anything to make our world the way we imagine we need it to be. But if we're able to realize the way it is, and maybe that's okay, then we have less struggle and we can push more of our energy into spiritual life. It's a simple thing, but it's a simple thing to realize, harder thing to actually do. All right, any other particular questions on this particular section? So this is, yeah, you have a
Sorry, one question. It's on behalf of someone else.
Okay.
You're mentioning, as Prabhupada says repeatedly, that the different periods of time that generally one would be in one ashram before going to the next.
Mm-hmm.
So 1 through 25 years is brahmacharini ashram. Right. Of course, our experiences that doesn't often correlate because sometimes people don't join the Hare Krishna movement until they're older than the 25 years, but they still want to be brahmachari, and it works. Mm-hmm. And then you also mentioned how the final stage, sannyas, beginning at age 50.
Vanaprastha, actually.
He was saying you can take sannyas at 40 or 50
right.
If you didn't do the other options.
True.
So I think it's where you got there.
Okay. I believe in Prabhupada's books we hear about these two latter stages, including sannyas, beginning at an earlier on, so Vanaprastha beginning at say 50, and in this modern age, it would seem that it would also be appropriate for that stage to start later. And then, of course, for the same reason I said before, sometimes devotees, they cease from being brahmacharis or brahmacharinis after they're well beyond the 25-year cutoff. Mm. So naturally, Vanaprastha, by that token alone, it ought to start later, let alone due to the factor that
these are all rules of the thumb. It's not that being on your birthday, on your 50th birthday, suddenly someone comes from the GBC and says, "Oh, have you decided to become Vanaprastha yet?" These are kind of rules of the thumb. For some people, it may be earlier. For some, it might be a little bit later, and I think that's there. These, even Prabhupada never suggested these things are exactly the way. But in general, that concept is there, that 25 years in, brahmacharini ashram, 25 years in grihastha ashram, 25 years in Vanaprastha, 25 years in sannyas. That assumes one lives 100 years, few people do. So anyway, that's kind of a rule of the thumb. And then which is different from what we were talking about over here, the idea that one can actually take sannyas at age 40 if they want. At least that's allowable according to ISKCON policy. So. All right, so this chapter has many interesting, flowery, important, and amazing concepts in it. We're going to be discussing the modes of nature, which is what largely this chapter has to do. It's an overview chapter, actually. So from, basically this first verse of chapter 18 up to about verse 12, we're doing, because this is a rehash chapter, so we're rehashing karma. Arjuna is asking this question, and up till about verse 12, Krishna is kind of replying to the question. And then from 12 through 13, is it 13? 13 through 18, we go to the next section, which we rehash jnana, talking about the idea of knowledge. And then from 19 all the way up till 71, this is where we hear about the whole idea of the yoga ladder, which is an important concept. Spiritual progression, there are various stages that people generally go through in this various processes of spiritual culture. So the very bottom stage, or a non-stage, is where people are just knocking it out in the material world, trying to make themselves happy. And this stage is affectionately called, in the Vedic, parlance, animal life. And then above that is where people are beginning to understand that they should follow some regulation. And that may be Vedic or some other religion. They follow some regulation. And that's called the kind of karma kanda stage, where one does not necessarily understand much about God, so one is not certainly not completely dedicated to God, but understands the need for some regulation. Then above that is the actual karma stage. And in that stage, then one thinks in terms of trying to please the Supreme, but still the reason one is pleasing the Supreme is so the Supreme will please him. So it's a, kind of using God as a tool stage. And then above that is the jnana phase, where one actually is done with material sense gratification, realizes it's a lost cause, it never worked, never will work, and one begins this mysterious journey through many philosophies, and is this right, what about this stuff, and hey, let's go there, let's think about that. And above that is the yoga stage, where one starts to think, well, why am I knocking my brains out to try to understand all these esoteric and peculiar philosophies? I can do some kind of physical action and I will get an amazing consciousness. So they engage in yoga. Above that is the bhakti stage, where one finally understands that what the purpose of yoga was, what the purpose of all this other stuff was to get around to serving the Supreme Lord. And that once we serve the Supreme Lord, then we are actually on the right path finally. We don't need to think about all these different kinds of philosophies. We don't need to do some difficult physical yoga. We're not trying to please God so he will please us. We're just trying to please God, period. And so this is the yoga ladder. And it's not necessary that a person go through each one of these phases. As a matter of fact, one can go directly to the bhakti stage. But of course, these phases are there. And some people will go through these various stages. They'll go through their jnani stage. They'll go through their maybe yogi stage. And eventually they'll come to the bhakti stage. And sometimes when people come to the bhakti stage, then they will see that while in the bhakti stage, they'll have their kind of karmi stage, their kind of yogi stage inside the bhakti, but they'll always understand that bhakti is the superior thing, but they'll have to work at not just theoretically understanding that, but practically living in the status of real bhakti. So that's what this chapter is going to go through a little bit later on. And then there'll be some concluding words. Arjuna will be asked the question by Krishna, so what do you want to do? And Arjuna will say, I'm with you, Baba. I'm going to do what you say, Krishna. So in the beginning, back in chapter 2, Arjuna said, please instruct me, but by the way, I'm not going to fight. So he said that in chapter 2. But now in chapter 18, at the very end of it, he comes to the idea that I've heard your words and I'm prepared to act according to your instructions. So in the 18 chapters of Bhagavad-gita, Arjuna went from not going to fight to okay. So that's what happened in the Bhagavad-gita. Krishna convinced him. So any questions about that? Because we're pulling up here toward the end.
You said about jnana and yoga.
Yeah.
But so like in 7th chapter, Krishna says that jnani, like he says, jnani is very dear to him and he treats like jnani as his own self. So
in the 7th chapter?
Yeah. It says like Tesham jnani nitya yukta ek bhaktir vishishyate priyo hi jnani yukta.
What number is that?
I think it's number.
What's the verse again?
It says Tesham jnani nitya yukta ek bhaktir
Let me see if I
vishishyate.
can find it. Okay, it's 7:17. Tesham jnani nitya yukta esha bhaktir vishishyate. That's the verse you're talking about.
Yeah.
Priyo hi jnani no tyartam aham sacha mama priya. Of these, one who is in full knowledge and who is always engaged in pure devotional service is best. For I am very dear to him and he is dear to me.
And actually, in the second verse, Krishna says, in the next verse, he says that he treats like jnani as his own self. He says, I always
This knowledge of me. Those who
Yeah,
seek
right.
knowledge
So
of me.
that's the there's an issue there, and that's commonly a stumbling block for a lot of people. That jnana means two different things. Actually, more than that, but for the sake of simplicity, we'll just talk about two specific understandings of jnana. One is, bhakti jnana or divya jnana, jnana of Krishna. That's always a good thing. And that's what we want. And that's what Krishna endorses. But there's also jnana in the usual sense, which means the process of speculation to try to understand the mystery of the universe, which is not a good thing. And this is what we are not interested in. So when we say someone's having their jnani phase, we mean that kind of jnana, or, just basically jnana as a material process to speculate about understanding the universe. So just be aware that those two things are two different things.
So it's a different jnani?
Right. Here we're talking about, when Krishna uses the word jnani, he's meaning the bhakti jnani, the person who is understanding specifically knowledge related to becoming a devotee, as opposed to speculative knowledge about the mysteries of the universe, which is a different thing. And this commonly trips people up, because you have to be aware that when you're reading the word jnana, which flavor of jnana are we really talking about here? Are we talking about jnana as a speculative process for understanding the mysteries of the universe? Or are we talking about jnana as knowledge specifically of Krishna? Okay, so that's how I respond to that. So according to Sasha, we are over time now.
Okay, Okay, just a quick comment.
Okay.
I'll override Sasha.
Well, he's right there.
Yeah.
If he speaks up, you can slap him down.
Sasha can tell me to stop too.
Okay.
Just a quick comment. No, it's just, I mean, by the same token, right? Sannyas. There's the sannyas that's done for Krishna, which is really,
right.
which is really, which is the bhakti sannyas, and there's sannyas, which is just giving up activities, and and then you're giving things up. You're giving up activities that are done with material desire. So you stop, but because you're not doing it for Krishna, you just stop doing everything, and then and that's not for Krishna, and therefore, as you were saying, it doesn't last because you're not actually being true to yourself. You have to do something, but do it for Krishna.
That's why this idea of sitting on the senses is a sure path to a big flop in life. It will not work. In Satya Yuga, people could engage in meditation, but the kind of people that were living in Yuga were not the kind of people that we have today. There were people who were very austere already, and their minds were very peaceful, so meditation worked for them. Plus, they had lifetimes that were 100,000 years, so they could practically spend 30 or 60,000 years in meditation, which few of us could probably pull off. So that's why it doesn't work now. So rather than trying to sit on the senses, which is a really dodgy proposition, we should engage the senses, but engage them in spiritual life. So the senses will be, as Prabhupada says, like snakes with their teeth pulled out, so they cannot harm us. Otherwise, they're like snakes with their teeth still in, which is not a good thing. Yeah.
How do you avoid getting into the desire that you do things for Krishna so that he will do things for you, which is inherent, I think.
Right. Well, to please God so he will please us is what qualifies as a religion all over the world, but it's not. It's substandard religion. The first step, of course, is to understand that, that pleasing God so he will please you is substandard. Of course, in 7th chapter of Bhagavad-gita, Krishna exactly says that such people are pious. He says that there's the arta, the artarti, the jigyasur, and the jnani. So the arta is the person who comes to God because he's in total misery and he wants God to save him. The artarti is the one that comes to God because he wants to advance materially. He needs some money or some thing. So he wants God to help him out, So these are pious people, but it's still substandard, And then we have the jigyasur, which is the person who's curious about the nature of the world. And then we have the jnani, as we've been talking about, the guy who wants to know the mystery of the universe. Is sure that being materially satisfying the senses is a dead end. There are people who finally come to that realization that no matter what you do in the material world, you'll never be happy by trying to find material happiness. It just doesn't exist. You can get a few drops here and there, but the actual process of being materially happy never works. So these are considered pious people. In other words, they're, as we were just saying, on the yoga ladder, they're in the basic levels of karmis or jnanis. So we have karma kandis, and then we have karma yogis, then we have what we call jnanis, then we have actual yogis, and then we have bhakti yogis. So these are gradual stages. And first of all, by understanding that really we should be trying to please God, not because he will do something for us, but just pleasing God because that's what the universe is about, And the more we do that, the more we become happy and satisfied, and the more we try to, put forward various little things that we want God to do for us, the more we get entangled in stuff that's frustrating at best.
So no ulterior motive.
What's that?
No ulterior motive.
Right. So we're trying to please God, period.
Right.
We're not asking anything back. Of course, God always tries to reciprocate with his devotees, but we're not counting on that. Right. We're not thinking about that side. Okay, so now we are 7 minutes overtime. And what happens? Oh, we do another kirtan. Okay.
So, Hare Krishna. Thanks for participating and hearing thus far. So now we just